The next speaker is Yuki Nishijima. The title is Static Typo Checker in Ruby.
Right. Thank you, Hidaka-san. My name is Yuki, and today I'm going to talk about static typo checker in Ruby. Uh, Again, this is me. My name is Yuki. In Japanese, like Nishijima Yuki. So when I'm in Japan, people call me Nishijima-san. But if you are English speaker, you can just call me Yuki. You can find me on GitHub and Twitter. My handle is usually at Yuki24. So if you have any question, just send me a message. I'm on the Ruby core team, and I also maintain a gem called Canary, which is a Rails paginator. I also made a gem called Digimi, which is now a part of Ruby. And I usually, as a Ruby committer, I usually maintain Digimi gem, but also propose new features to Ruby core to make Digimi more accurate and robust. I work for a company called Artsy. It's a startup in New York, and I also live in New York. And I came here from all the way from Hiroshima through Shanghai. And I had a really long layover in Shanghai, so I decided to get out the airport. And that is actually a really nice city. This is called Bonn, which is really nice. And if you hit, and there's like one of the tallest buildings in the world. And then on the right side, you can see Shanghai Tower. I didn't get to the top, but seems like it's really good. I also got on a maglev, which is the fastest commercial train in the world, which runs at 431 kilometers per hour, which is really fast. In miles, it's about 267 miles per hour. And I also found something interesting at the airport, which is a karaoke box. So this is a box that you can literally get into the box, pick a mic, and sing. So if you got really bored at the airport, you can just sing. That was really interesting. I really wanted to give it a try, but seems like that is out of service, so maybe next time. All right, so I'm going to talk about static typo checker, but before we dive into this topic, I want to talk about a few topics. The first one is what does a gem do? I think many of you are familiar with a Digimi gem, but I just wanted to let everyone here know that what the gem does. So let's say you have code that looks like this, which is just a string, and that calls a method called starts with. And it actually doesn't work because starts with is an alias that Rails defines. So in pure Ruby, you can't actually call that method on string. But if you require Digimi gem, it looks up the correct method name as soon as you get an error. And since Ruby 2.3, you no longer have to require because Ruby automatically required that gem. Let me also talk about recent changes in the Digimi gem. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the next version of Digimi gem, which is it's going to be 1.2. And that's going to be included at Ruby 2.5, but that's not going to be compatible with the current version of Ruby. And the current latest version of Digimi, which is 1.1.2, it's not actually compatible with Ruby 2.3. And 1.0, it is only compatible with 2.3 and later. And if you are still using Ruby 2.2 or earlier, you can only use 0.9 and 9. And I'm doing this because I wanted to use the latest features of Ruby core so I can make the Digimi gem more accurate and robust. Okay, so new features. This is really exciting. So if you are using a struct object, you can actually call a method by, it's like a hash, but you can give a key so that it's going to actually call a method internally. And what you actually get is not nil, but it just raises an exception, which is name error. So it used to show nothing, but if you use the latest one, it's going to actually suggest the correct method name. Okay, so next one. This is really confusing. Let's say you have name, and you are trying to assign a variable to name, and then you get error. Hey, name method or name variable doesn't exist. Did you mean name? It makes no sense, right? So in the latest version, I just took it out. Oh, excuse me. So in the latest version, it's not going to show confusing suggestions. Okay, so the next one, this one was also a common confusing suggestion, which is that you are trying to call a method on an instance variable, and if, let's say, the user's variable is like completely empty, it is just nil, but you can actually call a method on nil, and in that case, what happens is Ruby tries to call a method on nil, and what happens is, hey, map doesn't exist on nil. Did you mean tap? This also makes no sense. So I just decided to not show any suggestions if the receiver is nil. Okay, so the next one. So Ruby 2.3 and DigiMean 1.0.0 used to also suggest private methods. In this case, you're trying to call read, obviously, and then the next one is rand, which gives you a random number, and this also makes no sense. And this is happening because there used to be no way to detect whether the method call is, somewhere you can call a private method. But Ruby 2.4 added a new method called private call question mark, so that we can detect if is this called a private method call or something that is outside of the context. And then the next one is this is also very exciting, which is experimental features. So DigiMean used to have many more features. For example, if you're on Rails and you are trying to get a value out of a table, and sometimes you specify a wrong column name or table name, and in that case, DigiMean used to look up the correct column name for you. But it's not happening right now because it doesn't make sense to bring Rails features to Ruby core. So I needed to take out some of the features from the DigiMean gem. But these were like really useful. I really loved it. So I wanted to have a way of activating some of the features that I took out. So if you want to use an experimental feature, make sure to install DigiMean 1.1.2, which is the current latest version. And you can just require DigiMean/experimental. The first one is really useful. Let's say you have full name, and if you take a closer look at this declaration, that's actually a typo. And what happens is obviously it tries to call a method on nil because you can call any method on like any instance variable names. But if you require DigiMean experimental, what's going to happen is it tries to look up the correct instance variable name, which is extremely powerful. And then the next one is key error. I think this is becoming more popular to call fetch on a hash object. And right now, if you give a key that doesn't exist in the hash, it'll just raise a key error. But sometimes you make a typo in the key name, like this. But again, if you require DigiMean experimental, it's going to look up the correct key name for you. And there's a commit that I made just last night, which made it possible to implement this feature without multi-patching. So right now, this is accomplished by multi-patching hash and also key error, which is a little scary. But starting Ruby 2.5, it's not going to be necessary. So this is going to be promoted to like first-class feature. It's going to be no longer experimental, which is great. Okay, so the last one, let's say you have user class and you have initializer, and then if you take a closer look at here, there's a typo. But this is really hard to realize because Ruby is not going to give you non-zero error, and then instead it's going to give you an argument error or something. So what it does is if the method name for constructor is not the right one, if there's a method that is close to initialize, it's going to give you a warning and show, hey, you're trying to implement method on for the constructor, but it seems like there's a typo. Is this something that you really mean to define? Okay, so next one. In the latest version, you can actually use the DigiMean spell checker as a public interface. What you can do is you can give, like in this case, it is giving methods as a dictionary to the spell checker, and then you can say, I want to correct this string, which is send, which is a type of send, and it's going to give you send, which is great. A few weeks ago, a gem called Fastlane decided to use this spell checker to look up the correct action name. And then last week, we also added a new feature to look up the correct task name if there's a typo in the task name, which is great. So people are already using this feature, and then if you have a nav or something, you can also use the same thing. Okay, so this one is also very exciting. Jarabi support. Digimin used to work only on MRI, but today it is no longer true. You can also use the Digimin gem on JRuby, which is basically the same thing. Not every feature is actually working because of the way JRuby works, but most features are actually working. So if you're using JRuby, just make sure to use Digimin. Thanks to the JRuby core team, I think Charles or Annabelle maybe not here, but I really appreciate your work. Okay, so going back to the main topic, which is static typo checker. But before we talk about this, I wanted to talk about the problems that the Digimin gem currently has. So the biggest problem is obviously it's a runtime lookup. So what happens is you add a method call to your file, and then you spin up a Ruby process, and then if it's a Rails app, a request comes in, and then it tries to process a request to generate HTML or something. So it does a lot of things. So let's look up like what it actually does. So loading your application. Basically, MRI is a C program. So what happens is a C executable tries to boot up. And that's what happens when you say like Ruby or Rails or any Ruby program. And what's going to happen next is it's going to load Ruby gems. You can also disable Ruby gems, but I'm sure that most of you are actually using Ruby gems. And what's going to happen next is to load your code. Basically, you usually require dependencies first. It's like usually it's standard library and gems like net HTTP, delegate. Gems like Rails, active support, all the gems that you want to use in your app. And the next thing is you want to load your classes like user or project member or whatever you have in your app. And then when you are loading your classes, what could happen is metaprogramming. Like for example, if you are using Rails, you can say has many projects belongs to user and alias attribute to this one. These are all metaprogramming. This is done by define method and eval. And in other work, if necessary, for example, if it's Rails, it has to listen to a port. If it's Fluent D, it also needs to listen to a port. Sometimes you need to output a file or send a message to a standard out or standard error. And what's going to happen next is finally running your app. So let's say if it's a Rails app, web server receives a request, which is usually Puma or Unicorn or sometimes Rhetoric in development. And then the request is passed into Rack, and then Rack is going to pass that request into Rack middleware. And then it's going to process a request, and it's going to go all the way down to Rails controller. And then what Rails controller does is it talks to the database, and sometimes it makes a request to external services. Sometimes it needs to talk to Memcache or Redis to grab the cache. And then it also needs to log something if you need to. And then finally, it needs to render HTML. And what's going to happen at last is it's going to send everything back to the client so it can render something. So a lot of things happen. And then at some point, something goes wrong, like no error. And then finally, Digimin looks up the correct method name. So this is a lot. So what can we with it? We can do static analysis to the rescue. So let's take a look at a quick demo. This is a test file for Digimin, and I left some typos in the file intentionally. Oh, excuse me. I need to change the screen settings, so I'm going to switch to mirror. All right. And I'm going to zoom in. So here you can see typo of race, and then here you can see first name without under between first and name, and then if you scroll down, you can see first name, and this is actually L. So I left some typos intentionally to make sure that DigiMean looks up the correct method name. So this is a great example of what we can use to make sure that a static typo checker works fine. So what I'm going to do is to run Ruby and require DigiMean and static. And then I also need to make sure that live and test are in the load path. So Ruby can look up the file when you require a file. And then this is, I'm going to just copy the file path to this file, which is test.check-in method name test.rb. And it should be able to find a method called like this one and this one, or maybe this one. As you can see here, it was able to find undefined methods in the file. So I'm going to change this test to make sure that this is not really running the Ruby script. So I'm going to just run exit. And if you run rake test, what's going to happen is it's going to just exit immediately when it hits this line. So this is failing. But if you run static, it's not going to exit. It's going to just keep going and try to find all the methods, undefined methods in the file. So let's go back. So the question is obviously, how does it work? This is a brief summary of DigiMean static. Basically, what it does is to require an undefined method detector, and then it also needs to grab a project directory to make sure that none of the files outside of projects are annotated. The most important part is here, undefined method detector new, and then I'm passing project directory to it, and then it just calls undefined methods. This is actually doing a lot of complicated things because static analysis is actually super, super complicated, and Ruby is actually really complicated. So usually I don't use like a Ruby example because sometimes it's really hard to imagine that like how this is going to be helpful in your real world application. But for this one, I really wanted to use this one because if I were to use a real world example, it could be really, really complicated. So here, what it does is to define a who class, and then it has bar method, and it calls a method called I do not exist. And when you say undefined method detector, undefined methods, it could find I do not exist method, which is great. So how does it work? So when it comes to static analysis, of course, we need a parser, right? So Ruby has several tools that you can possibly use to parse out your Ruby file. The most popular one is reprint and the parser gen. And reprint is part of the Ruby, so you don't have to worry about dependencies. But if you don't have to worry about, like, if you can add any dependencies to your app, the parser gem is also great. There's also another one, which is Ruby VM instruction sequence, which gives you bytecode. It's not AST, but you can also use the same. You can also use bytecode to analyze your code. And in this example, I decided to use this one, mostly because Tanagachi-san and Naruse-san, they actually wrote a prototype of static typo checker using Ruby VM instruction sequence instead of using repro parser. So I just touch it over. But should be possible to switch to repro parser. Maybe not the parser gen, because if this were to be part of Ruby or something, it shouldn't depend on anything. And I wanted to eliminate dependencies as much as possible. So maybe in the future, I should switch to Reaper. So let's say you have a class who bar and I do not exist. And to be able to get a bytecode, we can just wrap it with compile. And if you call 2A13, this interface looks a little weird, but it gives you bytecode. And what it actually looks like is this, which is really, really complicated. So I'm going to summarize this one to this. So if you have class food, what you can find is define class food. So Ruby can define a class called food. And then the next one is obviously def bar. In the bytecode, it is actually called put object. And there are actually so many things happening between foo and def, surprisingly, but I'm not going to explain the whole thing. Oh, by the way, Kevin gave a great talk yesterday about AST and bytecode. Is he here? Maybe not, but he gave a great talk yesterday. So if you want to know more about AST or bytecode, definitely check out his talk. And then lastly, this one, I do not exist. In bytecode, it's opt-send without block, meaning that it's a method called without block. And here you can see I do not exist. And once you find all the method calls within instance methods, you can use a method like foo.instance methods or private instance methods to make sure that the method exists in that class. But hold on, this is actually Ruby code. All I showed you so far is all Ruby code. It's not really static, right? And that's actually true. If you run this code, what actually happens is Ruby parses out every single line in the file and tries to do what it should do, depending on what is actually written in the file. And the only thing that is skipped is this one. This line won't be executed, but this is really the only thing that is not run. So problems, it's not really entirely static, unfortunately. It still needs to load, spin up a Ruby process, and then Ruby needs to do some work to be able to find like all the available methods and also not undefined methods in the process. That also means that you can still call eval or exit or some other scary things to do. Like, for example, you can download a file to load. If it's a Ruby file, you can even eval. So you can still do a lot of things, a lot of dangerous things, possibly. So I'm not going to talk about problems right now. I'm gonna summarize everything later. So let's just talk about editor integration. This is really important because unless you could improve your developer experience when you're writing code, there's really no meaning to build a spell checker, a static spell checker. So this is really important. And then I'm going to show you another demo using VS Code. This is called VS Code. Has anyone used it before? Maybe most of you are, oh, that's one. So VS Code is basically an editor maintained by Microsoft, and it's actually really good. So I'm going to first open Digimon, and now I'm going to zoom into here, which is what we looked at. And obviously, this is a typo, and then you won't be able to call this method. And the same thing here, first name, and the same thing here. And what I'm going to do is to open VS Code Ruby, which is a plugin for VS Code to be able to, to make VS Code more helpful when you're writing code in VS Code. Now I'm going to change the get revision to return JSON, so VS Code can get JSON out of process. Now I'm going to run this plugin. Oh, that is actually quite fast. Now you can see here, this line is annotated, hey, this method is not defined. And this one's also undefined. And this one is also undefined. Okay, so how does it work? So there's a VS Code. It's running in your computer, and then what happens is every time you change a file or you save a file, it runs some JavaScript code to run a command. And then what happens is it runs a Ruby command to be able to get what's actually not defined in your project. And Ruby sends the JSON back to the VS Code session, so it can annotate undefined methods in the file. So how do we activate a VS Code plugin? This is like main in C. If you want to write a VS Code plugin, what every single VS Code plugin has activate. And in this one, we need to register a callback to the editor, meaning that I want to register a callback that gets called every time the user saves a file. And this is what is registered to the window. So let's take a look at what this function does. So here what it does is it makes sure that the document is saved. So Ruby can also use the same file. And then what's really important is here, it just runs a Ruby command with digime static, which we just tried. And then it just passes the file path to check. And as a callback, what it does is, so Ruby just sends JSON to standard out. So JSON can look up, VS Code can read standard out, and then if there's undefined method, it can annotate that method in the file. I'm not going to talk about how we can annotate methods with VS Code because it's really specific to VS Code, but it should be possible to do the same thing in with Vim, Emacs, or possibly RubyMine. RubyMine actually has the same feature, so maybe it doesn't have to, but there's going to be a way. And this is what the JSON looks like. The first part is basically for debugging purposes. It has Ruby engine, Ruby version, Ruby description, and then digime version. And then the fifth one is the most important one, which is a hash. Actually, it's an object in JavaScript. It has a key as line number, and then it has, it has undefined method name, symbol type. Right now, it can only look up method, but it shouldn't be too hard to switch to, suggest undefined class name or class variable or global name even. So right now, it's only method, but there's a plan to, expand the feature to more things. It also has path and line number, so VS Code can annotate the correct method call. So how do we generate that JSON? So we looked at this file, and then it has puts. And it's pretty easy to switch to JSON because you can just change puts to JSON. So that's pretty much it. And here, as you can see, you can call method name, caller source location, and also method line number. And the method detector does all the work for you. So what happens right now is, again, it's not really static. And then, unfortunately, if it's a large project, there are so many false positives. And then, again, if it's a large project, it's actually really slow because it needs to spin up a Ruby process and then look up all the defined methods in your project. And also Rails. Rails is a monster gem, and I really love it. I use it every day. But to be able to have really good support for Rails, what I might have to do is it has so many edge cases, so I might have to add one feature to fix one edge case. And then I think that's going to be a really big work. So how do we fix this issue, not entirely static? So technically speaking, it should be possible to switch to like fully static analysis. But at the same time, that also means that you're not going to be able to look up all the available methods on a class, because fully moving to static means you're not going to be able to use define methods, eval, or any other meta programming techniques. So this is going to be so technically possible, but it may introduce a lot of new false positives. So again, if you look at the bytecode, you can see that foo is going to be defined, and then boy is going to be defined on foo. So it should be possible. And again, too many false positives. So why does it have too many false positives? Again, dynamically defined methods. Let's say you have as many users, and then that's going to be dynamically defined, and then active record dynamically defines all the methods when you talk to the database for the first time by talking to the database and get table definitions. And right now, it can't handle method. It's not aware of method calls handled by method missing. This is also hard to detect. And then the next one is a little tricky, duck typing. Here's a file in mailgen, which calls delivered email and delivering email. And what it does is mailgen allows you to register a hook before it actually sends an email, so you can make sure that if this email is something that we don't want to send to, we can just replace that email with something else. If it's in development, you can just replace all the emails with like your email address, so you can make sure that you don't send actual emails to your users. But this is really hard to detect because technically this method is not defined in the mailgen itself, because that's what mailgen tells the user, that this method needs to be defined in your project. So technically, it is 100% impossible to detect this method is actually defined. And what RubyMine does is it also includes the test files to make sure that the method is actually defined. So so if you actually delete the entire spec file, RubyMine is not going to be able to look at this one. And what we might be able to do is to look up documentation. Like here, you can see the documentation mentions that you need to implement delivery email. So what we can do is in documentation, you can say this method only accepts class that implements a specific method which has a specific name. So one thing we may be able to do is the static typo checker generates the first version of like undefined method. It's a list of undefined methods. And after that, we can pass that result to yard filter. Yard is yet another RDoc. I think it's a gem. It is basically just a better version of RDoc. And we can just make a filter, and then that's what's going to happen. And what it should do is to filter out possible methods that you actually have in your project to reduce false positives. And you can finally pass it to the editor. And then the next one, not fast enough for large projects. And I was looking into this one, and then mostly that was because too many dependencies to load. There's another solution to make it fast, which is, I think most of you heard about boot snapgen, which is it generates a bytecode cache, and instead of reading, parsing a Ruby file and generating bytecode, it can actually cache the bytecode. So next time you try to load the file, it's not gonna do all the work to be able to spin up a process. And then the next one is finding suggestions. Suggestions is really slow. So if you look at this one, it has suggestions raised, which is great. So what we can possibly do is to pass this list to the editor. So what you can do is you can just hit a keyboard shortcut or something to replace mistyped method name with a correct one, which is great. But at the same time, this takes a lot of time. And also, this is also really inaccurate right now because there's no scope right now. So what it actually does is to look up the correct method name from the global. It is just basically just global. Everything's global right now. So it might find incorrect method names. So one thing is we can just take this feature out for now, and then make it accurate and fast. And once we can make it fast and accurate, we can just bring it back. And then Rails, this is gonna be really hard, and hopefully this is gonna be something that I can take care of in maybe 2 or 3 years. So I'm not really, I can't really talk about what I can do right now. But hopefully, once we figure out how we can take care of like the method missing and also define methods, all the meta programming stuff, dynamic stuff, hopefully that's gonna work with Rails. All right, conclusion. What I made is still really early stage, but if you have a really small project, like if you have a Gem project which doesn't depend on anything, that actually works pretty well. So if you have a like tiny Gem project, please let me know, and I can make a Gem, not a Gem, but I can help you set up static DGM in Gem locally. So please let me know. And then introducing a type system will help find undefined methods. But at this point, it seems too ambitious to me because if you want to add a type system to Ruby itself, that's going to be a huge change, and many people might not be able to catch up with the latest change, which is Ruby is a dynamic language today, so it might not be the best solution today. So what I kind of want to do is to try all the possible solutions, like using documentation, Yard, RDoc, and then adding a filter to the pipeline process, and then also support with editor. And lastly, static analysis is really, really powerful. It's extremely powerful. So if you don't know anything about AST, I would highly recommend to you learning about AST. All right. That's it. Thank you so much.
Do you have any questions?
日本語でもいいですよ。
すみません、リジュミンのジェムが Ruby に標準搭載されたいきさつみたいなのちょっと教えていただければ。
Okay, so the question is, how did the Digimon Jam got into Ruby core? あ、これ日本語で言った方がいいんですかね。ちょっと一応ここ英語のセッションなので英語で。It's a if I were to talk about the whole process, it's gonna be like 1 hour. So so that wasn't really easy, and then I did so many things, and then so many Ruby committers, so many other Ruby committers did a lot of work. Basically removing, so Digimon used to depend on something called trace point, which makes your Ruby process really, really slow. So we needed to make it possible to, get all the variable methods, all the variable names and also methods that you can possibly call in one context. And then we need to make that feature, and then Koichi-san and Nobu-san, and they did it for me. And then there's another thing, which is bundling Gem itself to Ruby. And then Shibata-san told me how we can, bundle the Gem itself, bundle the Gem to Ruby core. And then he helped me to, how we can ship a Gem and then make the Gem as small as possible. So it's gonna be like if I talk about that process, it's gonna be I probably need 1 hour or something. So that's a brief introduction of how we did it. But if you are interested in hearing more about like how that's done, just come talk to me after this session.
ありがとうございます。
Is there any other questions? It will be the last question. Do you have? If you don't have questions, I want to ask a question, okay? Do you have any plan to optimize this gem? It seems very slow.
Yes. So the current Digimon, the dynamic one, has a lot of optimization techniques. Then I might be able to do the same things to the static one as well, but I'm not sure if it's even possible because once we move to fully static, it's not gonna be possible to scope like this method, this class has these methods, or so yeah, basically that it's really difficult to make a scope if it's static analysis. So one thing we might be able to do is to leave some dynamic part in the process so that we can combine a dynamic part and also static part, and then possibly save some work to make a scope, and then reduce the list of strings or symbols as a dictionary, so I can make it fast with something. So there are some ideas, but I need to make sure that that is something that is applicable to the static typo checker.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nishijima-san.
ありがとうございます。